Welcome to the First Time Facilitator podcast. Whether you're a first-time facilitator or a seasoned pro, listen in for tips and tricks to make a bigger impact at the next workshop you deliver. And now, your host. She's embarrassed to say, but she watches Riverdale, Leanne Hughes.
Hello everyone and welcome to the show. I'm your host Leanne Hughes and I'm here to help you create unpredictable workshop experiences that predictably work. Today's show is sponsored by my personal website, my business website, leannehughes.com. I was lucky enough, I think 10 years ago, to attend an event and the guy said the best real estate you can buy is your own domain name. I had it parked for about 8 years and finally using it, so that feels good. So on that site, I'm continually trying to figure out my services and offerings. This episode will be released when I'm in Hong Kong. Yes, I'm still here. I've got a pretty exciting next couple of weeks too, so after, I think I fly back, this episode's released on the Monday, fly back on Thursday morning. I'm back home in Brisbane for 4 days before joining my hero, author of Pivot, Jenny Blake. So I had Jenny Blake on the show a few episodes ago, and I'm joining her in Paris. Yes, Paris. So we are running a Train the Trainer workshop for, I can't mention the brand, but it is the world's most iconic fashion label. So think of that. Think of a French fashion label, the most famous one you can think of. It's probably the one, I just can't mention their name. So we're running a Pivot Train the Trainer workshop there. I still can't believe I'm getting to hang out and help Jenny in an amazing city for an amazing client. And I'll be sure to share some of that experience on the podcast as well. And probably more so on Instagram. I'll be sharing a few things in Instagram stories, so you can follow along at Leanne Hughes. You're in for a delightful listen this week as I'm interviewing a superstar facilitator, Ingrid Thompson from healthynumbers.com.au. Now, Ingrid is an educator, problem solver, and the founder of Healthy Numbers. She describes herself as a sponge, particularly a learning sponge, so I think she's with the right audience. She loves listening and reading and building and absorbing all the knowledge so she can share that with you. In this show, we talk about Ingrid's fascinating career history and what she's achieved over the years, which is very impressive. She is a master of the career pivot. We talk about how she was given an opportunity working in training and development, how she cracked it into that team by given a really opportunity and having a manager that saw something in her, which I think these types of managers are just amazing. And I got my leg up from a similar manager who saw the potential. Ingrid also shares her number one advice for facilitation, and she draws parallels between her yoga and Pilates background into the way that she facilitates. She also shares a couple of fantastic stories of where things went not so well in her workshops, and as well as some strategies on how she overcame those as well. I think it's nice to hear these stories every now and then to remember that we are in a game which is full of unpredictability. Ingrid is extremely enjoyable and easy to listen to. She is articulate and a wonderful communicator. I'm grateful that because of the podcast, we've reconnected after a couple of years to have this conversation and that we can share all of the learnings with you. Now, remember, if you'd like to continue the conversation when the podcast is over, join the community of over 270 facilitators from all over the world on the free Facebook group called The Flip Chart, where we share all sorts of cool activities, videos, share our challenges, share our wins. It's a really supportive community. We're all driven by the same thing, to make our workshops engaging and different. You can view a link to the group and other resources mentioned in this episode in the show notes at firsttimefacilitator.com/episode 84. Now, on to the show. I would love to welcome to the First Time Facilitator podcast, Ingrid Thompson. Ingrid, it's so great to have you on the show.
Leanne, thank you, and hello everyone. And Leanne, it's taken us a while, hasn't it, to get our act together, but it's been lovely. Do you know, it's nearly 2 years since we met. I can't believe that's almost 2 years ago. Phenomenal.
I cannot believe it. You're actually right, because I think it was October 2017. It was the second day of the We Are podcast event in Brisbane. I was running a bit late, but there was a seat up front at a table, and it was your table. That's where we met.
And there was those other gorgeous women from Port Macquarie, and my VA was there, and then we all went to lunch, and it's history, isn't it?
It is. And like you said, 2 years, and I will take accountability for it being so long. I'm trying to get my schedule intact, but hey, we got there, and it's great to have you here. I was wondering if you could share with our listeners a bit about you, how you've wound up in a role now, what you're doing in terms of helping small business, but as well as what type of workshops you lead, and just a bit of your backstory.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's that expression about join the dots backwards. You don't sort of realise how much of something you've done until you start to create your story for what you're currently doing. And if I look back, I was a Girl Guide leader, a Sunday school teacher. When I came to Sydney, I joined the YWCA and was on the board. So I've always had that sort of helper teacher. I helped students when I was at school with their maths at high school, because I would finish and then the teacher would be trying to help everyone. So, when I look back, there's where my teenage years were spent helping, teaching, bringing knowledge to people who needed to sort of come along that journey. And in business, when I first started work, I sort of fell into accounting because I love numbers and patterns. And I was always looking for ways to help the people in the business understand the business aspect. So, when they were doing their budgets or when they were reading their reports at the end of the month, just really helping people understand what that meant. And I worked at the Sheraton Hotel, and I did food costing, which was fascinating. I loved it. I was able to be in the kitchen, and we measured things and we counted, and manpower planning and manufacturing accounting. So it was really never a tax return accountant. I couldn't, that's not me, but the actual numbers side, but also helping people understand why that was important in that sort of aspect of their business. And then I had a pretty big pivot. I was working in a manufacturing company, and we started using Motorola's Six Sigma methodology, and some of the people from Motorola actually came out to Australia, and I was one of the first teams that was trained by them. And I just kept volunteering for projects that I, whether it was that Six Sigma, and then there was some other projects I got involved, but I could never crack the training and development role. In those big companies, and Leanne, you might have seen it in the businesses you've worked in, is people in the engineering department or in the accounting department and the marketing department, it's very hard to get into the training and development department. They see you in that role, and they kept saying to me, you're such a good accountant, just keep doing the projects. And it was the early days of OD, and I was really desperate, and I really wanted to be in that department. Anyway, for a variety of reasons, I left that company and went to work somewhere else. And there was a role came up to redesign the performance management system. And I applied for it, and the minute I met the man who was to become my new boss, we just knew that we were going to have a professional future together. So that was my leap away from accounting. So even though I'd sort of done training from the accounting point of view, I'd never actually worked in a training department. But that led to me being able to work on a 2-day change program that actually changed my life as well as the participants that we worked with, because I couldn't work out what we were doing to the people in the room. I learned my script for the modules that I ran in the 2-day workshop, but something happened in that room over those 2 days, and I was fascinated about how people learn and the journey we took them on. So I went to UTS, did a course, and started to understand what it is we do when we facilitate and train really well using some of the models that is not about children's learning but about adults learning, which is so very different. And it's just been an ongoing path since then. And then I left the corporate world. I work with small businesses now. I studied leadership training, team training. So a lot of my work is around customer service, around understanding communication, understanding business. Yeah, so that's it kind of in a nutshell. It's 30 years worth.
Story. You have packed so much into your life.
Yeah, there's a lot.
I've got to, just on your point, talking about trying to get a role in training and development, because I do have some listeners asking me, they are the experts in that technical field, which is what you were, Ingrid, and how do you crack into that team? And thank you for sharing that experience. My experience was I was working in a government role. One of my colleagues was working in the workforce development team. She took a leave of absence. She had a baby, and her role was advertised. And it was really funny because I've always been interested in, I did psychology and human resources at university, but I didn't even think of applying for her job because I was working in marketing. I was relatively happy. And there was actually my husband who was on Seek at the same time. And he's like, hey, there's a role here. Why don't you go for that role? And I was like, oh, that's not a bad idea. So it's funny how opportunities within businesses, when you can get an internal leap, is really helpful. But like you said, it is tough even to recognize that you should go for it in the moment. Can I ask you, you mentioned that when you're going for that role with the performance management system, that you met your future manager and you knew that you'd have a career together. What was it about that interaction with that manager that led you to believe that, yeah, you could get a step up here?
It's just one of those sliding door moments where you just know that the future is there in front of you. He is an amazing man. I think his willingness and his openness to see the potential in me, he could see that what I had done outside of work, the fact that I'd been on projects, equipped me skills-wise to do what he needed done and to work with him. And he could see my attitude, my willingness to try out things, the fact that I had this accountant role all over me and good results from having studied that. But at the same time, such an empathy for people and understanding how when we do what we do really well, you actually can impact more than just the kind of niche that you're in. I knew when we started talking, he just got me. He just understood. He was so different to every other manager I'd ever worked with. Look, I had fantastic mentors in all my businesses. I was really lucky, actually, lucky or, in the right place, right time and good work. But we had a company gym and I used to go to the gym early in the morning, and some of the most senior managers in our company were at that gym in the morning. And so here was me, just the intern accountant, working alongside pretty much the CEO, on the bicycle, and the was dropping off. But it was such a leveler. And
yes.
Because it was an in-house gym and there was only us, and the guys were just there to do what they had to do, and everybody pulled their weights and they did their lunges and they did their stretches. And so over a year or two, I got to know those people and they got to know me, and some of my opportunities came from that. But it also was what reinforced that I was an accountant. So it sort of had its up and its down. I heard somebody recently talking about luck, and he said, actually, it's not luck. It's the right place at the right time and the right amount of work that's gone into it. So I think we make our own luck, but it is about right place, right time.
Yeah, and I like that you use the gym as a big leveler. It's funny because when I go to the gym, I always try and I don't think I'm competitive, but I want to stay on the treadmill longer than the person next to me. And I guess the gym, that's the first time anyone said that. Usually it's like, oh yeah, I've seen them at the bar, and it's because in the Australian culture as well, it's like, yeah, we hang out and over a few drinks late, on a Friday afternoon. But to hear that it's a nice, healthy option, which matches the business that you're in. And I love that you shared that story about the guy that gave you an opportunity, because again, the same thing happened to me when I moved back to Brisbane. I was applying for roles and I wasn't really getting too far, having lived in Western Australia in a small town. And this one guy, Daryl Cox, I'll name him out, he same characteristics as you. I think he noticed something in my resume. We had a conversation and we just clicked, and he's the one that really gave me that springboard. So if you're listening in, I think hopefully you can be around or get that opportunity, right place, right time, to have someone in your life that can give you that opportunity. Or if you're a manager or leader of teams, you can start looking for that potential with people that don't necessarily have the training and development background, but have that attitude and have delivered over the course of their career.
I think that last point is very important, Leanne, because even just as you're saying it and I was saying it there, is we can also be in the position to give people an opportunity. If we've had that opportunity given to us, sometimes it's a really good thing to reach out your hand and give somebody else the opportunity as well, to see potential in other people, because our own unconscious bias can sort of say, oh, well, that person's an engineer and maybe that's how they will always be. But, what potential do others have that we're missing out on the flip side to that?
Yes, and very good that you mentioned unconscious bias, because then we often look for people that remind us of ourselves as well. So it's actually, and that's the beauty of this podcast. I love interviewing facilitators just from diverse backgrounds that have different ideas on things, because it just challenges me in terms of my approach that I take with workshops, and hopefully for the listeners that are tuning in. It's funny because this is a facilitation podcast, and you mentioned adult learning theory, something that you studied to learn a bit about training and development. And I don't really talk about, I haven't really made an episode on adult learning theory, but wondering if you could sort of weave it into what you think the good skills are of like a really engaging trainer or facilitator from your perspective.
I think it really is about getting out of your own way. It actually is all about the people in the room and the content. I recently heard a wonderful expression, be where your feet are, and it's this idea of being present, which is such a challenge today because we're just distracted all the time by so many things. But when we're here, we're thinking about something else that we could be doing over there. You know, we're at work and we're thinking about what's happening at home or what could be happening, you know, in another part of our lives. And then when we're in that other part of the life, we're thinking, oh, I've got this other stuff to do. But it's that really idea of being present. And I think that's what happens in the room. I was having a conversation with a colleague recently, and we were saying that there's something that actually happens when you just are fully in the room, the energy, the knowledge, the wisdom, and just by asking the right questions at the right time and really listening to what people are saying and not thinking about what is the next question you're going to do. And we often have an outcome we want as a facilitator or, you know, we need to get to this point. But sometimes less is more. I do yoga and Pilates and they quite often, they say, don't try so hard and you'll actually get the pose much nicer. And I think sometimes with facilitation, look, there's all the listening and being prepared and having your pens that are, you know, ready to write on the board. There's all those, I mean, something worse than lifting a whiteboard marker and it doesn't actually work or using those technical skills. But I think the real secret is to be in the room with the content, with the people.
That's a really, really great quote, be where your feet are. I think what I'm observing and what I do too, I'm very guilty of it, is I'm where my fingers are, which is on my mobile phone. So
there's a children's book called Be Where Your Feet Are, and I've ordered it. I haven't got it yet. I'm just so I'm going to read it on my podcast because I just think it's going to be gorgeous. You know, it's that whole idea of be where your feet are.
Hey, I love that you drew the analogy to yoga and Pilates when you talked about facilitation. I don't do too much yoga. It's usually something that I do when I go on holiday because I've got the time, even though I should make the time when I'm here. So when I do it once every 3 months, I expect myself to be flexible. I'm obviously not, but I'm trying to really push myself. And you said, we'll actually try and relax into the pose. It's the first time I've heard that. Putting you on the spot here, but can you draw any other analogies with your yoga and Pilates work, with the work that you do in your facilitation and small business?
Oh, breathing. I think that goes without saying. And just slowing down. One of the things, I'm an extrovert, and I'm an extrovert in my thinking as well. I'm actually a very private person, but when it comes to thinking, I prefer to think out loud, and that's part of my thinking process. And so a danger for me when I'm training or facilitating, and Leanne, we were talking about this at the beginning, is that we can actually go off track really easily. And so being really prepared and being really present, it just goes back to that presence. And in yoga, it's being in the pose, not thinking about where the pose is actually going. And I think that's, you know, when you're doing some of the, you know, a sun salutation or some of the actual sequences, you know that the next move is the foot over here or the arm over there. And it's not about that. It's about stay with where you are. And I really think that applies to facilitation as well. It's just when you're in a topic, the thing is that you can actually know that you've got to get through all this stuff and you've got this long, but you'll get more out of what you do by staying with what's being worked on at that moment. And that's particularly true for facilitation rather than training, because facilitation is often using the content that you've got rather than actually an agenda.
That's right. Yeah, that's a really great analogy between the two. And again, it's good that you mentioned that, because often when I'm doing this yoga once a quarter, and that's probably like not the best news for you, but
better than not at all, Leanne. Better than not at all.
I'm holding a pose and I'm like, when are they going to change it to the next one? Like I'm already sort of wanting it to end because it's so tough for me. So being present is really key. So in terms of your preparation, how do you get into an area where you are focused? Like what sort of things are you doing to prepare even a couple of weeks out to the night before and even the morning of a workshop?
Well, there's a few different things. So if I'm actually putting it together myself and I've got the topic. So recently I gave a presentation. It was an hour long to an international audience, and I let it percolate for a really long time. Normally I like to have things done early. I could just feel this topic sort of percolating, and I did some research and I read some things and I made some notes and I tested it out with people. So in terms of that preparation, until it comes together. And I use Post-it notes and I rearrange the Post-it notes. And then once it's together, I actually write it out in longhand. So type the whole thing out, print it out, and then start saying it out loud. So I'll stand up and see if it lasts for an hour or if it lasts for 40 minutes or whatever that timing is. And the same if I'm doing a facilitation where I'm going to have to ask questions, I think really clearly about how to ask the question so that it will actually bring out the discussion that's necessary. So I think there's a real art to getting the right questions and to being able to present something in a way that people can actually follow and understand. And then if it's a presentation, like my one was recently, is that I'll practice it, I'll record it, I'll listen to myself doing it so that when I actually stand up to do it, it's fully ready to do. On the day, breathing, I don't drink alcohol for the day before, I go to bed early, I eat well. I think physically it's so important to be highly tuned and ready for whatever's going to happen in the room when you're in front of a group of people. So I take that very seriously. And if there's a series of questions or a facilitation, I do actually like to have my questions written down. And sometimes I'll put them on a little Post-it note on a flip chart so that I can write them out, or I'll write them out on a flip chart and then I'll unfold the flip chart so that we've actually all got the same question. So it depends a little bit on what the task is or what the role is and what the outcome is, but I'm very prepared. I don't think you can wing this stuff. You sometimes have to wing it with what happens in the room, and that's when you draw on everything you've got to make it work for everybody, but it's all about preparation.
Yes, I definitely agree, and so true about the quality of the question as well. I actually really like that if it's such an important question, you have it sort of pre-written somewhere as a trigger, whether it's on the wall or in your own sort of notes, just so you make sure that you ask that one, because like I said, the quality of the question can determine the quality of the conversation and the learning and what the group really gets out of it. So actually that's not something, to be honest, like I really focus on content. I don't focus on the questions, which now that you're saying that to me, it's like, oh, of course. I'm really missing a key element there.
I'm sure you're doing it unconsciously or subconsciously. And the better you get at it, the better you get at asking good questions. It is a skill, and you think, gosh, where did that question come from? That's a really great way I ask that, because you can tell you've asked the right question because you get the right answer. And years ago, somebody said to me, don't ask guess what's in my head questions, because that's not fair.
No, it's really not fair.
So many people do it, and you can sometimes see it and you think that's not fair. You haven't given me enough information for me to know what the response is that you're wanting. And the group want to give you the response that you're looking for, so make it easy for them to do that.
Yeah, particularly if it's a closed question, there's only one right answer, you haven't given them any ideas. I think that makes people feel really unsafe in a room. Like if I'm going to answer and I'm wrong, then I look like an idiot, my status is dropped. So, yeah, it creates a lot of buttons.
So all of that flight or fight stuff triggers off, and then you've lost them. And nobody likes to see anyone else treated like that either. So another thing I never, ever do is I never pick on anyone in the room. So if Leanne's over there with her fingers on her phone instead of paying attention, there's no way in the world I will say, so Leanne, what do you think about this? There's no way I would ever do that to anybody, because I think that just people don't like to see that done to someone else, and it's not really a nice way to treat people.
Yeah, I'll have to ask you, this is a follow-up question. I'm really curious. So if I'm on my phone in a workshop, what kind of strategies would you take in that?
I might walk closer to you as I'm talking. Or another way of dealing with a behaviour that's not what you want in a room is sometimes someone in the room will take care of it for you, depending on what it is. So the facilitator or the trainer doesn't actually have to be the one doing it. And if there's enough people doing the fingers on the phone thing, then maybe there's something wrong and we all need to stand up and do some swings or, hip rolls, or maybe everybody needs some blood circulating to their bodies because it's not really working. But I think that's part of reading the room. And who knows, you might have a sick child, or you might be texting your husband, or, there could be something going on that you need to be on the phone. And that might be something we'd talk about at the beginning is there any reasons anybody needs to be in the phone? Come and speak to me at the first break and we'll cut that slack. But it's better if we can have the phones off the desk or something like that.
I like that you said maybe there's something else going on, and I think often we have to check our own assumptions, because it can be very easy when we're up the front and someone's like on their phone or distracted and we're thinking it's because I'm boring, or it's something that I'm doing or they're just being disrespectful. So there's a lot of assumptions in both of those comments. So I guess what you're doing there is thinking, well, what else could be happening for this person? And that's why it's really important not to single that person out. That strategy of just walking closer to that person beautifully. It's such a magical trick for behavior management, don't you think?
It sure is. And I think what you said there about making the assumptions is, given that this podcast is called First Time Facilitator, I truly think that these kinds of skills come with more experience, that you feel more confident, because I'm sure there was a time when if somebody was writing on their pad when I didn't think they could be, or on the phone, I mean, when I first started training and facilitating, there were no phones, but there was always distractions of some sort, somebody looking out the window or something. You think, oh, I'm so boring. But maybe that's how they listen, and it was only through my experience that I was able to then have other reasons that people behaved in certain ways.
Yeah, it is the experience. And unfortunately, you just can't hack that. I wish I could say to all of you, Magic Wand, you're going to be amazing facilitators, but every opportunity, new audience, different clients, the content, a new person. And this is what I discovered after talking to people in this game for 20 or 30 years, that they've got the same struggles, but they're just learning to, I guess, not be attached to it. Like you said, then they've got other ways of interpreting situations because of the experience and the breadth of audiences that they've worked with. On that note, have you ever had something not go so well in a workshop that you'd like to share with our audience, like a lesson that we can all learn from?
Well, actually, it's so interesting. You've just reminded me of something that happened a while ago. I went to run a workshop for, now I think it was a government department, might have been a 1 day or a half day workshop. And there was a woman came in late. So the group was all there and she came in late and the only spare spot was right down the front. And she came in and she put her stuff down and she may have said sorry or, sorry I'm late or something like that. But I don't really recall there being much of that. And she sort of sat with her arms folded, clearly not wanting to be part of the group at all, not wanting to be there, not anything. And I guess by that stage in my training and facilitating professionalism, I'd reached a point where I knew people had been sent to programs against their will. And I'm never taking that personally. I haven't had anything to do with that. I'm here doing my job, and that's something for you to take up with your people. But at the very first break, I always like to go to somebody like that and just check in with them. And sometimes if there's enough of it in the room, I will actually say, how many of you are here because you were told to come? And I just say, let's call the elephant in the room. Some of you might not even want to be here, depending on the topic. So let's just be clear. We're here together for the day. Let's make the most of it. I'm going to do everything I can to take care of you and to provide you with some value. If you really don't like it, all I can ask you to do is not disrupt everybody else who actually wants to be here. So really just being clear about how it was. Anyway, this woman, she was a youngish woman. How it turned out was she'd come down for this job and it was in Canberra, and she'd been living in Canberra for some weeks. She had nowhere to live. She was couch surfing.
Oh my gosh.
So she had been brought down on this job. They'd transferred her or brought her down, and she actually had nowhere to live. And the night before, she'd actually slept in her car.
Oh.
That's what turned up in the room the way she did. It was nothing to do with me. I mean, I was nearly in tears when she was telling me. I just thought it was awful. But that wasn't, like, she just didn't want to be there. All she wanted to do was find somewhere to sleep at night. And she was still expected to do her job. But whatever had happened, something had happened with the paperwork or I don't know, I can't remember the details of it, but I just remember her saying, I slept in the car last night because I have nowhere to live.
Oh my gosh, that's disgraceful.
Yes. So you just don't know what somebody's story is, do you?
No, you don't. And I mean, I'm just thinking like Maslow's psychology, his whole pyramid.
Absolutely.
It's like, I just need some shelter. I mean, didn't even have the basics met, let alone how would she, gosh, that poor woman.
No wonder she didn't want to be in the workshop, me telling her how to manage her time or whatever it was something to do with processes or systems. That was one that occurred to me just as you were saying that. But I had another one. This was a big challenge, is I co-facilitated that 2-day workshop. That was one of my first public gigs that I did in a big corporation, and I didn't particularly get on well with my co-facilitator, and that was incredibly challenging because we were facilitating, going through a series of activities over the 2 days for two aspects. It was the airline, so it was Qantas merged with Australian Airlines, and we were working with them to work together. The two of us, sometimes it worked really well and other times the two of us didn't work together that well, but we had to look like we worked together really well. And because that's what we were teaching them to do. So That was a huge challenge. And I just had to every morning okay, we're here to do the best we can. We've got 25 people in the room with us. It's them that's important. Set aside any of my stuff that was going on. And I'll take responsibility for some of that as well. But we didn't always just gel. And when I looked at the other co-facilitators, it felt like they all got on so well. And the two of us, I don't know, we were a bit different. And maybe that was good too. It was good. It was huge learning for me. Huge learning.
Oh, yes. And like the game of co-facilitation, it's a completely different ballpark as well, because if you're facilitating, does the other person jump in? It's all about assessing that dynamic. I guess the tough thing about that was like you had to sort of play a role. And a lot of the time when we talk about the great facilitators is like they're very authentic, but you couldn't be authentic those 2 days.
You can have another podcast, Leanne, saying the first time co-facilitator.
Been off to the show, that's right. And just going back to your story about that young lady as well, I think the important lesson out of that is that you went over and you had a chat to her. So if you hadn't had a conversation with her, you might have gone back to your hotel room or your home later that night and said, oh, what could I have done better? But it had nothing to do with you. And I think yeah, again, it's great that you asked that question. So, I mean, that was a really great gig with Qantas. How cool is that? Where have you presented? Have you presented at any really cool conference locations around the world? Or?
Well, when I was with them, that I did actually have some great opportunities because we were doing some self-managed teamwork. And this was in the 90s when self-managed teams were a huge thing, and Train the Trainer. And I was actually invited and I was happy to do it. So I went to Dubai. Now, that doesn't sound quite so fantastic now, but in those days it was pretty fantastic because it was the late 90s, early 2000s, and Dubai was just starting to be exotic. And I presented to a very large room full of people about self-managed teams. But I have to say, and again, it was a Qantas experience. I did a workshop in Cairns. I used to do quite a lot of work with Cairns Airport in North Queensland, for people who maybe don't know where Cairns is, because I imagine your podcast goes worldwide, Leanne.
Yeah, I sent from Venezuela email this week.
So Cairns is in North Queensland and it's dripping tropical and it's hot. And we did a workshop at 5 o'clock in the morning because that's when the guys mostly worked. There was an airport team. I say guys and girls. They normally started work at 5 o'clock. So we ran the workshop at 5 a.m. We were in a shed with an air conditioner that was so noisy we could hardly hear ourselves. So that was kind of exotic in its own way.
Nice one. And look, I think Dubai is still exotic. I love Dubai.
It was pretty special because I'd never been to anything like that. And because of the conference we were at, we went out into the desert and I got my hands painted with henna. And yeah, that was a pretty amazing experience.
It's a really cool gig. It's one of the perks of being in this field, getting the opportunity to travel. Now, let's quickly just switch gears and I'd love you to tell us about your book. So you want to start a business. A lot of the recent episodes I've done, people have been asking me about how to start a facilitation business, which I'm flattered by because I've only been doing it for 7 months. But I want to hear from an expert. Can you just share a bit about your book and what sort of compelled you to write this?
Well, I was in a program and writing a book was part of the program. It wasn't compulsory, but publishing was a part of being seen as someone who's an expert in your field. And when I looked at what I did, I'd been teaching a start a business course through a community college, and it was hairdressers and plumbers wanting to start hairdressing and plumbing businesses. And then I noticed it was changing, and this is probably nearly 7 or 8 years ago, and it was the accountant coming because they actually wanted to open a flower shop, or the policewoman who wanted to teach yoga. So it was somebody wanting to start a business that was nothing to do with what they did. Now, today that's passé. I mean, every second person wants to start a business other than what they're doing. But 7 or 8 years ago, that was still quite unique. And I thought, this is interesting. And it was sort of starting to trend. So this is about 5, 6, 7 years ago. And then when it came to writing the book as part of this program, I thought, well, what do I know about? Because I know about lots of things. And I thought, well, getting started in a business is something that most people don't know about. So it's tailored for everybody, but my particular interest is health professionals. So people who are really good at what they do from a patient care, client care, health point of view. So yoga, Pilates, chiropractors, physiotherapists, they're taught a lot about the body. They're taught a lot about how to do what they do. So many of them start a practice, but they don't know very much about a business. But it's for everybody. It's 7 steps. It's about you, and then what's your idea and what problem do you solve, who's the client. There's a couple of chapters about money and compliance, and then marketing. Anybody can read through it. It's got lots of activities in it. Anyone who's thinking about starting a business, it's like Business Startup 101.
Awesome. I think that's going to be very helpful for a lot of our listeners. And it was really great how you spoke through your process of picking a topic, because you could have written a book about many things, judged from your career history. And I think what's great is that you've just decided and you went down one avenue, but it doesn't limit you at all. Yes, this is tailored for people in the health profession, but it can be used, the process works for many industries. And I think it goes for the same with facilitation. A lot of the people I talk to are related to one particular industry, but what they're sharing with our listeners, what you're sharing today, can be applied across all the facilitation for all the different clients, whether you're in a for-profit, not-for-profit, government, all those different sectors. So I think the key is just picking one and just going for it.
You're touching on something really interesting there, Leanne, because when you've got a set of skills, when we're thinking about facilitation, you can facilitate anywhere and anything. And sometimes not having a lot of knowledge about the content is actually very powerful, because you are much more curious. To get credibility with a group of people, you do need to demonstrate an understanding of their situation, because everybody feels like their industry or their particular situation is special. However, the facilitation questioning techniques, as you say, applies to any industry. So having enough knowledge about the industry to give yourself credibility, and then having enough curiosity to help the people get to where they need to go.
Yeah, one of my favourite authors, David Rock, he talks about this as well. He says the best coaches are the ones that actually have no idea what technical field that they're coaching, because they're just very curious, ask the right questions and elicit the answer from the person. So the whole asking versus telling is very powerful. Now, if you could give yourself advice when you were starting off your facilitation career, what advice would you give to yourself or any first-time facilitators that are listening in?
And I'm not sure when I realised this. It might have been as people said to me, you've changed my life, or you said something in a workshop. Maybe I'd bump into somebody and they'd say, oh, I know you. You ran that workshop 2 or 3 years ago and you changed my life. And I'm not sure I realised the power. I'm putting my fingers around that with those little quote things. But when you're in front of a room, it's a privilege. And I'm not sure I really felt the weight of responsibility of that in the early days. And maybe that's a good thing as well. But I do think it's a privilege, and never underestimate the people you're working with. I've got a super fast story. So I was running a business acumen program for a whole range of different people who had different numeracy and literacy skills. And I was helping this fellow. He was asking me directly the question, but I asked him a series of questions to get him to lead himself to answering his own question. Like David Rock says, you lead the person. We're not asking questions that he wouldn't know the answer to, but I led him to it. And then I heard him then do what I did to him to another person. And somebody went, whoa, go facilitator Sam. So he had immediately seen what I did with him, and he repeated it to the person who asked him the question. And I will never forget that moment, because on paper, he might have looked like someone who maybe had different literacy and numeracy skills to some of us who do the sort of work we do. But he got that I led him to the answer, and he did that to somebody else. Oh, wow. And I thought, I still get goose pimples when I think about that story. That other person went, whoa, go facilitator Sam. And it was like they all got that he did what I did. And, yeah, it was magic.
I love that, because it's like a meta moment for that guy. He's like pulling himself out. He is. He's like, and rarely do people do that. Live through life, we don't really sort of pull ourselves out and reflect on what's going on. We're just living it all the time. But he just pulled it out and goes, oh, this is the process. Super clever. And you're right, there is a ton of power, and I think it can be paralyzing if you really think about it. We wouldn't have the night before a workshop. So I think it's good to balance that out. Ingrid, I've really enjoyed this conversation with you. We've covered just a massive array of topics in a small space of time. So if our listeners would like to connect with you further to talk about all of the subject matter areas that you're just brilliant at, how can they get in contact with you?
Well, the LinkedIn is my go-to place. Ingrid Thompson. I'm based in Sydney, so search for me, Ingrid Thompson. If you put a little note, I connect with everybody, and I'm totally happy to answer any questions through LinkedIn. I have a website. It's healthynumbers.com.au. So that's my website where my information is. And I have a podcast called So You Want to Start a Business, the same as the book. And we're about to have our 100th episode. So I'm feeling very
Every podcaster's dream.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about that. And I still have a whole lot of podcasts sort of lined up after that. So we'll be going for the next duration. So those are probably the three best ways, either through my website or I'm Ingrid at healthynumbers.com.au if you want to send me a direct email. But I do have admin assistance, but I answer all my own emails from anybody that wants help. And I'm more than happy to help anybody with facilitation or anything else to get started in their business. Yeah.
Amazing. And I love that you mentioned LinkedIn first up. It's such a fun platform at the moment. I'm really enjoying LinkedIn, and we'll put a link to all of those of what you mentioned in the show notes for this. But yeah, it's been super enjoyable. It's been worth the 2-year wait to get you on the show. Thank you so much for everything that you've shared with our listeners today. It's been great.
Well, and Leanne, thank you for this show, because I think it's such a fantastic topic. As soon as I saw that you were doing it, it was like, yeah, this is the podcast that we need. It's fantastic.
Hey, thanks so much for sticking around. You've reached the end of another episode of the First Time Facilitator podcast. Connect with the show at firsttimefacilitator.com or follow me on Instagram at Leanne Hughes to find out what I'm up to during the week. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to share it with someone who will also appreciate the insight, and make it easier for yourself and subscribe to the show in your podcast player of choice. Thank you so much for listening, and chat to you next week.